All right, we are in 1 Samuel chapter 26 this morning. You open your Bibles to 1 Samuel 26, that's where we'll be picking up. And of course, just kind of keeping in mind the larger context of what we're talking about in Samuel, there's actually two incidents in the book of 1 Samuel where David has an opportunity to kill Saul. And Saul is pursuing him in the mountains, and Saul just happens to run into where David is, unbeknownst to him. And both of those times, David does not take that opportunity. He refuses to stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed. In 1 Samuel 24, the incident was that David and his men were hiding in a cave, and Saul comes into the cave to relieve himself, and unbeknownst to him, David and his men are already in the cave. And David's men are all saying, go for it, kill him. And David cuts off the edge of Saul's robe. And as Saul is leaving the cave, David reveals himself to Saul and says, I had the opportunity to kill you and I did not. Now may the Lord judge between us as to what is right. On that particular occasion, Saul was so shamed with guilt, he had so much egg on his face at that point, that he told David at this point, David is more righteous than I. He admits to David that you're going to be king instead of me. And they leave and they part ways with the understanding that Saul's not going to chase David in the mountains anymore and try to kill him. The only problem is that 2 chapters later we have the same thing going on in 1 Samuel 26. Once again, the Ziphites have sold David out to Saul. They've given away his location in verse 1. And we talked about that Thursday night. And David goes down into Saul's camp, and one of David's mighty men, Abishai, offers to strike down Saul with the spear that is sitting near his head. That would be poetic justice, wouldn't it? Kill Saul with his own weapon. Kind of the same thing they did to Goliath. But David says no. He says, who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt? As the Lord lives, surely the Lord will strike him, or his day will come that he dies. And last Thursday night, again, we talked about how that's an echo of the story in between these two incidents. In between the 2 chapters where David has opportunity to kill Saul, he has a run-in with a man named Nabal. And Nabal is, he's rude to David. He refuses to give him provisions after David has helped him and his men. In response, David's about to kill him, but is restrained at the last minute by the pleading of Nabal's wife, Abigail. And, what happens is that 10 days later, the Lord strikes Nabal himself and Nabal dies. There's a lesson that David's supposed to get out of that. And the lesson David's supposed to get is that the Lord is the one who will deal with David's enemies. David does not need to take vengeance into his own hands. Anyhow, that's as far as we got Thursday, more or less. We learn, of course, that the Lord really has been giving Saul into David's hands. In verse 12, it says that a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. But just because God provides us with an opportunity does not mean we are supposed to take said opportunity. And so now, I would like to pick up reading in verse 13, and I would like to get a volunteer to read verse 13 all the way down to the end of the chapter in verse 25.
David went over to the other side and stood on top of the mountain far off. Great space. David cried to the people and the Abner, the son of Hur, saying, Abner? And Abner answered and said, who art thou that thou criest? David said to Abner, art thou not a valiant man? Like to thee? Wherefore then hast thou not kept watch over thy lord the king? For there came one of the people and destroyed the king thy lord. This thing is not good that thou hast done. As Jehovah liveth, ye are worthy to die, because ye have not kept watch over your Lord, Jehovah. And now see where the king's spear is, and the water that was at his head. Saul knew David's voice, and said, is this the voice of my son David? And David said, it is my voice, my lord, O king. And he said, wherefore doth my lord pursue after his servant? What have I done? What evil is in my hand? Now therefore I pray thee, let my lord hear the word of his servant. If it be Jehovah that hath stirred thee up against me, let him accept an offering. Cursed be they before Jehovah. For they have driven me out this day, that I should not cleave inheritance to Jehovah, and go and serve other gods. Now therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence then one of the young men come over and fetch him. Jehovah will render to every man his righteousness. For as much as Jehovah delivered to thee into my hand today, and I would not put forth thy hand. Behold, as thy life was much set by this day in mine eyes, so let my life be much set by in the eyes of Jehovah. Let him deliver me out of all tribulation. Then Saul said to David, Blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt do mightily and shalt prevail. David went his way, and Saul returned.
Okay, now we look at that, and once again, David reveals that he has spared Saul. But unlike last time, he doesn't talk to Saul directly first. He talks to somebody else. Who does he talk to? His head commander, Abner. You know. And what would you say is the gist of that conversation? Why is Abner in so much trouble? You haven't guarded the king. Yeah, everybody in the camp was asleep. Nobody was standing guard. David was able to walk up right next to Saul. I could have run him through with his own spear. And what does David say about all this? You know, what should happen to Abner and his men? You should die. Yes, you did not. David did not kill Yahweh's anointed, but he pronounces a death sentence on those who guarded the Lord's anointed because they didn't do their job right, and he could have been killed. And if it had been anyone other than David in the camp, Saul would have been killed. Saul would be dead. And David says, I've been in your camp. Here's proof. Jug of water and a spear. You remember that spear you had near your head, Saul? It's gone. That spear that you've thrown at so many people, that's been taken away. And well, that's a source of. This would have been an embarrassing situation. I think we need to appreciate just how much how much emphasis this would have been placed, on the job of a soldier in guard duty. If you failed in that duty, if you fell asleep on the job, well, you could be put to death over that. It's interesting that they would be held accountable, even though a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. In verse 12, yes, Mark. I don't know. There is I guess there is kind of a vague irony to that. Abner is eventually what happens in 2 Samuel 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's a conflict between David and the tribe of Judah and the rest of Israel, which is following Saul's last son, Ishbosheth. But Ishbosheth is a complete weakling. The real power behind the throne is Abner. And when he and Ishbosheth have a falling out, Abner goes over to David and says, I'm joining your side. Forget this. And so they make a peace accord at that particular point. And then as Abner is leaving the city, Joab and Abishai kill Abner in retribution for killing their brother Asahel. So I don't know if David's words here could be considered prophetic or not. But Abner certainly does meet a rather gruesome end later. Now in 1 Kings chapter 1, David instructs Solomon that Joab cannot go to his grave in peace because he killed Abner, the son of Ner, and Amasa, two men who were better than he was, and shed the blood of war in the time of peace. David did not look favorably on the death of Abner. He writes a lament over it in 2 Samuel chapter 3, I believe. I don't know what to do with that. That's an interesting question. Long way of saying I don't know. Okay, all right. Well, now then Saul responds to David. He recognizes David's voice and he calls David his son in verse 17. This is now the second time this has happened. 24 verse 16, he said something similar. Is that your voice, my son, David? How does David address Saul? As God's anointed? What about in verse 17? How does he address him? My Lord, and he addresses him as my Lord the King. What he's doing is he's pursuing his servant. Yes, but he addresses him as my Lord the King. It's the same thing as before in chapter 24 and verse 8. He asks the question, why are you pursuing me? All the same things we saw in chapter 24 are being repeated here. Pursuing David, That's like trying to hunt down a single flea or a partridge. Who's going to take national resources and devote them to the hunt of a single flea or a partridge? A minor irritation, hardly worth this mountain trek that Saul has taken his whole army on. He's taken 3,000 men on this in verse 2. 3,000 men. I mean, what would be the outrage in the media if the United States government was devoting resources to track down a single flea in the mountains? And I'm not saying that to open up a discussion about what the government does and does not do right. I'm saying that to say that, this is ridiculous. Why are you doing this, Saul? You're chasing after one of your most devoted servants, and what have I done to you? And David even makes Saul an offer. What if David had hypothetically done something wrong? How does David propose we deal with it? Let God handle it. How? Verse 19. Okay. Right. He's saying, okay, maybe you're chasing me because I did something bad and the Lord has stirred you up against me. It wasn't an intentional sin. I'll offer a sacrifice and we'll deal with this. Under the law of Moses, if a man sins unintentionally, in Numbers 15, he could offer a sacrifice to atone for his sins. It was only the high-handed sins, it was only the defiant sins that the Lord would not forgive and cut off people from Israel. But if men have stirred up Saul against David, well, what should happen then? Let them be accursed. Cursed are they before the Lord. They've driven me out so that I would have no attachment with the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Now, of course, what men have stirred Saul up against David? The men in Saul's mind, the voices that told him what to do, right? Saul, the only man who's really been stirring up Saul against David is Saul himself. The Ziphites aren't helping, that's true. The Ziphites, this is the second time, David's over here, come and get him. I think that, they're trying to win favors from the king in the process of doing so. But the person who's really stirred up Saul against David is Saul himself. And so when David pronounces a curse, he says, if it men who have stirred you up against me, cursed are they before the Lord. Well, he is pronouncing a curse on Saul implicitly, ultimately. But David says something else too that I think is interesting. They have driven me out today so that I would have no attachment with the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. What would you say about that? Why does he bring up go serve other gods here? Okay, he's been anointed. Okay, yeah. There's something else here too, though. It's like, when have people said to David, go serve other gods? What would that be? Well, when have they said it, though? Well, it says here that, they'd driven me out so that I would have no inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Verse 19. End of verse 19. When would that have been said to David? Was that actually being said to David? Okay, yeah, exactly. Forcing David to flee from Saul means forcing him to leave the land of God's inheritance. And forcing him to leave the worship of Yahweh's people. Forcing him to leave Israel. Forcing him to, Now, of course, David actually has one of the priests of Yahweh with him in his traveling group here, Abiathar. Because Saul killed the rest of them, so who's really serving other gods at this point? But still, it raises an interesting question. mistreating somebody and trying to drive them out, you're basically saying, go practice idolatry. Go serve other gods. Can we do something like that today? Yeah, absolutely, what if we drive somebody away from our congregation by treating them cruelly, unkindly? We're forcing them to go serve other gods. We're being like Saul and his men were to David. Anyone who does that is accursed. It's like placing a stumbling block before your brother. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 18. If you cause one of these little ones to stumble, it'd be better for you to go drown yourself. Hang a millstone around your neck and be cast into the sea. And David in verse 20 says, do not let my blood fall to the ground away from the presence of the Lord. That's an interesting comment too. What's that talking about? I thought God was everywhere. Right. Yeah. And that's another point that we need to bring out here. There was, on the one hand, of course, there is this belief that God is everywhere. On the other hand, of course, though, you're only supposed to worship God in their law in the place where God chooses. If David is driven away from that place, if David is driven away from the ark of the Lord, from the tent of meeting, from wherever he could possibly be, well, how can he worship the Lord if he cannot go to that place? And so it's a question that needs to be raised here. David does not want to be in that situation. He does not want to be away from the presence of the Lord. And by driving David out from his presence, he has prevented David from worshiping the Lord as he ought to have. Don't let my blood be spilled in that circumstance. Oh yeah. It's interesting. David's perspective on this whole thing is not, Saul, you're driving out your best administrator, or Saul, I'm upset because I haven't gotten my paycheck in 3 weeks, or something like that. It's not that. It's, what about my relationship with the Lord? That's the important thing here. And what about your relationship with the Lord, Saul? Why are you going to bring guilt on yourself, and why are you trying to bring guilt on me? But in all of this, David sees the Lord's will as absolutely primary to the situation. David's not interested in holding a grudge or maintaining personal vengeance. He's determined not to slay the Lord's anointed. He's also determined to get the Lord's anointed to do the right thing, maybe. Well, in verses 21 through 25, Saul confesses, I have sinned. Return, my son David. Where have we seen this conversation before? The last one. We've also seen it one other place. I have sinned. Return with me. Aha, yes. Remember 1 Samuel 15. After Samuel says, God has rejected you from being king, Saul says two things. Number one, well, I've sinned. I'm sorry, really. And the other thing he says to Samuel is, return and worship with me before the elders of Israel. Why does he do that? Yes, Saul is trying to save face in that particular scene. And, would he be trying to do something similar here? Do we think Saul's repentance is any more genuine here? God is the judge for that, right? Would the return of David help Saul save face a little bit? Who knows? Right. And this is the problem. Saul has gotten so used to violating his conscience and breaking his word and forcing himself to do the wrong thing. He can't be trusted to be consistent. He may be sorry today, but what happens tomorrow and the next day? That's true. Luke 17, if a man comes to you 7 times a day saying, I repent, you forgive him. I'd get suspicious after the 3rd or 4th time. You probably would too. Right. Yes. And that's all true. And David, David forgives him. He lets him go here. And, David basically says, something to this effect. David basically says this, first, here's your spear back. You just took the guy's weapon, now you're going to give it back to the guy who wants to kill you. Secondly, the Lord will repay. And that is what David says on that particular occasion in verse 23, is that the Lord is judge over this. I guess David, he doesn't say anything about giving his water back, that's true. Yahweh will repay everyone for righteousness and faithfulness. He gives credit to God again here. We talked about, did God give Saul into David's hand? Well, David seems to think so. He says, the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I refuse to stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Oh yeah, well, there's a lot of situations in the Bible like that. You think back to Exodus 33, Exodus 32, people of Israel, they build a golden calf, and the Lord says, stand aside, Moses, I'm going to destroy this people. Well, why tell Moses about it? Why not just do it? Well, because there's a situation where Moses is being tested just as the nation is. And Moses' response, don't kill these people. Why? Because Moses is concerned with the glory of the Lord. Moses is concerned, the nations might blaspheme if they find out that the Lord is killing the people that he just went to all that trouble to get out of Egypt. Well, it's the same thing with David. David has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't take it because he respects God. Because he respects the Lord's will. Because he respects the fact that the Lord's anointing oil has been poured on this man. And because just as David himself is the Lord's anointed, if David hopes to command any respect in that role at all, certainly he ought to respect Saul as well. Even if Saul is completely defiling the office in every way imaginable, even if Saul has completely turned his back on everything that God stands for, David still does not have the right to stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed. Again, there's a lesson about how we should respond to authority as well. No matter how, I dare say, no matter how corrupt any government gets, it'd be pretty hard to touch Saul, I think, in terms of how far gone he is. And yet David refuses to stretch out his hand against him. I wonder what that says about us and about our attitude towards authorities that exist that are established by God. Saul calls a blessing on David in verse 25. Blessed are you, David, my son. You will both accomplish much and surely prevail. They don't return with each other. They part ways once again. It's not a sign that they have not been reconciled. That's just any comments or questions or thoughts on this chapter? We've kind of... yes? Well, that's an interesting question. And I think we kind of got to look at that in chapter 25, actually. Because Nabal's not the Lord's anointed, and Nabal was cruel to David, but for a much smaller reason, for a much smaller wrong, comparatively speaking, than Saul's committed at this point. And David just said, okay, come on, we're going to go kill everybody that belongs to Nabal. And it is only when Abigail confronts him that he listens to reason. If David had killed Nabal and taken vengeance in his own hand, that would have been wrong. And David recognizes that after he's reasoned with. But it is interesting to note that. Okay, I saw Don's hand and then Mark. Oh, yes. Mark.
With the book of Romans, quite probably compare Paul, we have to say probably. But Paul in the 13th chapter basically by God.
Yes.
And we may not understand that. We're to respect that authority. No matter how bad it gets in this country, we need to understand respect our ruling authority. They are corrupt. I believe they are today. They were put there by God for a reason.
Yes.
So this story about Saul and David, what the same principles apply to us today that apply to David back then.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that that's a good point to just to bring out again, is that no matter how corrupt government gets, it does not excuse anyone to disrespect authority. I mean, unless we come into a direct conflict with what God has said, in which case we serve God rather than men, unless we come into a direct conflict with what God has said, we need to respect our leaders and obey them and submit to them. There's a reason Paul quotes in Romans 13, there's a reason Paul quotes, you love your neighbor as yourself in that context. Now that's a hard thing to do. I mean, there's probably no one here that's more cynical about the government than I am, but I'm sure there's somebody that's going to argue at that point. But at the same time, we have to respect the authorities that God has put in place. This is a good point, I think, to just notice in passing. It's not the main point of the text of Samuel, but it is something I think that is written for our learning and instruction, like Don said. Anything else before we get into chapter 27? Chapter 27 is a short chapter. We should be able to cover this pretty quick. Can somebody... Oh, let's see. Let's break this up. How? Okay, I guess, can I get somebody to read the first 4 verses? All right. Is this the first time David's fled to the land of the Philistines? No. You remember back in chapter 21? Similar thing. He had to feign madness before Achish because they were getting suspicious of him. David's a national hero. For some reason, this time he's actually able to get into the inner circle. Last time he had to feign madness, and Achish said what is my favorite quote in the book of Samuel: "Do I lack bad men that you have brought one to act the madman in my presence?" Well, David... In this instance, though, David flees to the land of the Philistines. A couple things are clear from this. Number one, why would David do this? Okay, all right. So David clearly does not trust Saul to keep his word. And I mean, I probably wouldn't either. At the same time, people have also brought up the question, does this mean that David does not trust God to keep his promise to put him on the throne? Really? Okay.
Part of it. There's an old saying, God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah.
God is not going to take a fool who does something stupid because he's a children, help him to consequences. And so for David to go right back into Saul's presence, start playing the harp for him and all of this again, Saul's history.
Yeah, at the same time, the expression "God helps those who helps themselves" is not in the Bible at all. It's a quote that's invented by men, and I frankly don't believe it because it's not true. It's, God helps people, and frequently you see people trying to help themselves too much, and God doesn't help them. Response. I do think we need to consider David. We need to consider that David is human and that he's not perfect. Obviously, not everything he does is completely right and read through rose-colored glasses. We might look at Abraham. Abraham was a hero of faith, but not everything Abraham did, I think, indicates trust. You think of him lying to Pharaoh or Abimelech and things like that. Well, no. Nobody's disputing that. I think the question arises, of course, is, why doesn't David just continue what he's doing and hiding in the mountains? Why fraternizing with the enemy is... Well, and there's some problems with that, of course, and fraternizing with the enemy and, getting into this pagan environment, basically doing exactly what he was afraid of doing in chapter 26, being driven away from the presence of the Lord. Done. What he does works. I agree with it. Which, by the way, verse 4 also implies that Saul's still searching for David. Which means that what he said in chapter 26 didn't work out. I'm not disputing that David is wrong to not trust Saul. But I do want to ask a question. Where is God in this chapter? Maybe we should finish reading the chapter and see what becomes of David's visit to Philistia. Start in verse 5 and read down to verse 12. All right, well, let's summarize a couple of the things here real quick since time is low. First of all, David is not completely interested in assimilating himself with the Philistines. We get that from verse 5. Why should your servant live in a royal city with you? Give me one of your cities. David gets the city of Ziklag, which was technically supposed to be a city that Judah possessed anyway, according to Joshua 15:31. Ziklag becomes a permanent possession of the kings of Judah. And David lives a year and 4 months in this Philistine territory. Now, what eventually happens, in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, we learn that while David is in Ziklag, a large number of people continue to defect to David from various tribes, from Benjamin, from Judah, from Gad, and Manasseh. And if you want to read a long list of names of people that defected to David while he was here, read 1 Chronicles 12. David, while he's in Ziklag, what's he doing? He's clearing out Canaanites. Okay, yeah. The Geshurites were Canaanite people that Israel was supposed to destroy and didn't. The Girzites were another Canaanite group, probably from Gezer, and Ephraim failed to drive them out in Joshua 16 and Judges 129. And the Amalekites, well, we've seen the Amalekites before, haven't we? Where did we see them last? Okay. In 1 Samuel 15, the Lord commanded Saul, go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. And Saul didn't do it. Well, he mostly did it. But mostly obeying isn't the same thing as all obeying, actually obeying. And the result of this, of course, is that we still see Amalekites after the fact. The Amalekites aren't actually completely destroyed until the time of Hezekiah. In 1 Chronicles 4, I believe, mentions that. But David goes out and he kills the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, and like the dread pirate Roberts, he leaves no survivors whatsoever. And he captures the spoil, the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, the clothing, which technically I guess is what Saul did. He took spoil too. David is, I will say this, what David's doing here is he's tying up loose ends from the Canaanite conquest. And we might go, okay, that's, doing something right, I think. But there's another element to all of this too. What's he trying to do? How would the Philistines feel about the fact that David was killing Canaanites?
Like it.
No. Yes. David claims, he lies to Achish. He tells him, I've been attacking Judah and Jerahmeel and Kenites. And in reality, David hasn't attacked anybody in Judah at all. He's been attacking Judah's enemies, the Canaanites and the Amalekites. He's doing the opposite of what he says he's doing to Achish. And Achish swallows this lie and concludes that David's defected too far to return. He's past the point of no return. He's made himself odious to the people of Israel. He's going to stay a Philistine. He's going to be on my side now. He thinks he has David's undying loyalty when in fact David is merely a long-term mole, spy, sleeper, whatever you'll call it. Now what do we think of all that? Yeah, well in chapter 30 we have in chapter 30 there's another a rather extended account of how David attacks the Amalekites and delivers his own family from them, and sends a lot of the spoils to his family members. We'll get to that eventually, hopefully next week. But in this particular context, we'd say David. What do we think of David's deception here? Militarily smart, okay. A little bit to Abigail. Mm-hmm. Okay. There's, I think, another thing to consider. And, people, again, sometimes people take this to be a lack of faith on David's part. I don't know what I think of that. I'm back and forth on it. I'm just mentioning this because, again, this is one of those questions that the Bible doesn't tell us, and God thought this was bad, or God thought this was good. Well, God's not really mentioned in this chapter at all, actually. And we're kind of left to sort of draw some conclusions for ourselves. And that's the hard point, learning how to judge with righteous judgment. No survivors, of course, is crucial to David's deception. But I think one more thing, the bad chapter division here obscures one of the other results of this. In verses 1 and 2 of chapter 28, it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men. And David said to Achish, very well, you shall know that what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. And this, I think, puts David in a difficult situation. Because David is now being asked to actually go out and fight against Israel in the army, in the ranks of Achish, in the armies of Achish. In some ways, this is David's lie backfiring on him. He claims to do something to Israel. Now you're actually going to be forced to do that to Israel. Joining the Philistine ranks in this official capacity would completely destroy his credibility among the people. And it would put you at risk of fighting and harming Saul, the Lord's anointed, whom David has said so many times that he does not want to stretch out his hand against. And how do we resolve this dilemma? Well, at this point it pauses, and we don't find out until chapter 29 how David gets out of this situation. But chapter 28, we got to turn our attention back to Saul. Because Saul's in a dilemma now, and the armies are gathering against him. We'll pick up next time with chapter 28 and Saul going to Endor. Yes, that's a good point to bring out as well. I hadn't observed Psalm 56, but Psalm 34 is a psalm that David wrote when he feigned madness before the king of the Philistines. Psalm 56, when the Philistines seized him in Gath. That appears to be another instance in the 1 Samuel 21. Well, yeah, I mean, those are good points to make as well. I'm not really sure what to do with this. This is a complex issue, and I'm still not settled. But thank you. Psalms 34 and 56 are good to look at.